And welcome back to our, or actually I should say also plain welcome to, welcome back to everybody, and just plain welcome to those newcomers here. I see a new faces which I'm not familiar with yet. So welcome to all of you to our winter cycle of 6 conferences. As usual, a reminder, please turn your cell phones off and just make sure that you sign the attendance sheet at the entrance now or during the break. I guess it's not too late to wish all of you a very happy and healthy New Year. And by the way, we have a beautiful audience here today, so maybe I'll be running for some office. I haven't decided which yet, but if this continues, I'm very proud of having such a large audience. We started out like 2.5 years ago now already, with 15 people the first time, and I wondered if there was a potential crowd here in Montclair or Montclair area to listen to all this depressing news week in and week out. But so it seems. So you are the, I don't know, the 100 masochists in Montclair or Montclair area who come for more on a weekly basis. But anyway, thank you very much for making this our get-together such a success. This week has started with this year, I should say. We haven't seen each other since late November, actually. Has started with a bang, if I may say so, in the area of foreign relations, foreign affairs. Anyway, with the, as you very well know, with the U.S.-Iranian threat of military confrontation at the beginning of the year, which naturally took central place for a little while, at least at the beginning of the year, upstaging actually another very important development, which in a way flew under the radar, which was the re-election for a 4-year term as President of the Republic of China, of Ms. Tsai, much to the displeasure of the leadership of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, which is increasingly annoyed with Mrs. Tsai's Mrs. Tsai's party challenging China's official one China, two systems formula that Beijing has been trying to impose on Taiwan, on the Republic of China, as it has, as you very well know, recently for the past 6 months on Hong Kong, with the results that we know. And this is only January. 4 days from now, as you also might remember, Brexit should finally become reality, at least on paper, since the practical modality of the divorce between the UK and the European Union will have to be worked out during a transitional period of 12 months up to January 31st, 2021. and they have to be worked out to the satisfaction of both sides of the British Channel. The question today is whether 47 years of very close economic ties between the UK and the continent can be undone in one short year remains to be seen. And many analysts believe that that will not be possible, and that Boris Johnson, who's the Prime Minister now in the UK, will have to ask for yet another extension beyond January 2021. But more on Brexit probably next week. We might revisit Brexit more in details when the withdrawal becomes official. In the meantime, the big question in London is whether the famous Big Ben will chime on the evening of January 31st, which is next Friday, at 11 p.m. London time, which is midnight European time. Well, I forget that the UK is in Europe also sometimes, but midnight Brussels time, to mark this historic event, as most of the proponents of Brexit have suggested. Now, the problem is that Big Ben is under repair right now, and it will cost between $500,000 and $600,000 to restore it for one evening. Now, the question is, who will foot the bill, and is it all worth it? The public debate around this very existential question has been just as passionate lately as Brexit itself. So I'll tell you more about it next Monday, including the development and what can be expected from Brexit. Because as far as Brexit is concerned, this was the easy part, believe it or not. It lasted 3 years. It went back and forth. It cost the UK 2 elections and a change in government to reach finally something that had been voted on 3 years ago. But now Brexit has to be worked out, and it remains to be seen if in January 2021, if we still meet here, we'll have come to some kind of solution. Another issue is that you might have seen in the press that today and tomorrow, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his main opponent, Benny Gantz, are in Washington. They've been invited by President Trump to come here. Initially, they had been invited for tomorrow. The reason why Gantz decided to come to fly in today, because he will meet separately with President Trump today on this long-awaited American peace plan for the Middle East. Now, the reason why Gantz flew in today and not tomorrow with Prime Minister Netanyahu is because he doesn't want to give the impression back in Israel that since they'll be running against each other in the next elections, which are scheduled for March 2nd, the third election, parliamentary election, by the way, in the past 12 months in Israel. He doesn't want to give the impression that he and Netanyahu can get along, including on a peace plan. So he'd rather meet President Trump separately. Why this plan, if that's the case, is unveiled or made public today and tomorrow, remains somewhat a mystery, since, again, nobody expected this plan that had been expected now for 2 years or so. Nobody expected this plan to be unveiled before the next elections in Israel, which would make sense. Many observers say that this is supposed to give a boost to the incumbent, to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, as you might remember, is indicted on 3 counts of perjury and corruption. And the reason to unveil the plan is to change the conversation in Israel from his indictment to the peace plan. So that would give Netanyahu 1 month to talk to the Israeli public opinion about other things than his indictment. That being said, this is also the reason why Gantz is in Washington today, because he will be flying back tonight to Israel to be present in Jerusalem tomorrow, when a debate by the lawmakers in the Knesset will be deciding the fate of parliamentary immunity for Netanyahu from these corruption cases during the political campaign leading up to the elections. And finally, let's not forget, but how could you even if you tried, that this is an election year in the United States. And that the reason why I mention it to you is that undoubtedly, this being an election year, every political decision in this country, domestic or international, will be colored, anyway, made by the administration at this time, will be colored by these elections in the next 10 months or so. That being said, now, to predict that 2020 will be an eventful year is not really it's really an easy enough bet. What is more difficult to measure at this time, anyway, is how much of the current form of transactional and unpredictable foreign policy will endure, and how much will vanish if Donald Trump is not re-elected in November. Today, Washington is both eager to retain the benefits of its global leadership, but unwilling to shoulder the burdens of carrying it. And as a result, in terms of foreign policy anyway, neither friend nor foe knows quite where America stands on many, if not most, issues. The roles of other major powers will also have to be monitored this year. China, for instance, exhibits the patience of a nation confident in its influence and growing influence, but in no hurry to fully exercise it. It chooses its battles, focusing on self-identified priorities, such as domestic control and suppression of potential dissent, like we have seen in Hong Kong, unsuccessfully up to now anyway, and the mass detention of Muslims in the Xinjiang province, its growing military presence in the South and East China Seas, its economic expansion in the Caribbean, in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and the ongoing tariff dispute with the United States. In contrast, the other major power, Russia, displays the impatience of a nation which feels disrespected, actually, after the end of the Cold War, and eager to reassert its power. Kremlin's policy abroad is opportunistic in nature, seeking to turn crisis to its advantage, portraying itself as a truer and more reliable partner than Western powers. It backs some allies directly, militarily, like in Syria and lately in Libya, while sending private contractors to sub-Saharan countries to signal its growing influence. And yet, whatever the shape or form this expression of power is, all the world powers have something in common, which is they assess situations in terms of how those situations can promote their interest and or undermine those of their rivals. This ebb and flow in support by major powers has had actually an unintended positive result, which is that in many cases, lately anyway, in the past year or two, regional leaders were forced to soften somewhat their positions and seek compromise and diplomacy over dogmatism and confrontation. For instance, Saudi Arabia, the leaders of Saudi Arabia, who were initially encouraged by the Trump administration's apparent blank check, flex their regional muscles in the Middle East until a series of brazen attacks on their oil facilities and noticeable U.S. non-response, because the only time when the U.S. responded by killing General Soleimani in Iran was after the U.S. embassy in Baghdad was attacked, and not after the attack on the Saudi oil facilities. This non-response, or maybe muted support by the U.S., showed the kingdom the extent of its exposure, driving it to seek a settlement that is, which it is trying to do now in Yemen, and perhaps even maybe a de-escalation with Iran. Likewise, the Afghan government and other anti-Taliban power brokers are also somewhat and progressively readjusting their previous uncompromising views, accepting that U.S. troops will not be around forever. Similarly, the Syrian regime might show some flexibility in the near future, seeing that Russia's military support does not protect it from Israeli airstrikes. These regional actors might not be entirely on their own. However, this conditional support that they receive from their major protectors goes a long way to bringing them down to earth. So there is virtue in realism. Now, since this is our first get-together of the year, I'd like us to have a quick overview of a number of current hotspots around the globe in 2020, in no particular order. Obviously, we will revisit these issues as we go along, if and when necessary. I will start with Afghanistan, and that's the reason why you should have so many countries on the map, on the papers that were. I would start with Afghanistan if I could find it. Well, you have it on your, on the papers, where more people in Afghanistan are being killed as a result of fighting than in any other current conflict around the globe. Separate attacks by Taliban insurgents in Afghanistan have prompted Washington and the Afghan government in Kabul to step up their strikes and their special forces raids, with civilians often bearing the brunt of the violence, particularly in rural areas. And yet there is a feeling that this year may see the conclusion of the peace process, or of a peace process which was set in motion last year and then interrupted. Indeed, for the first time since the war began, some 19 years ago, Washington prioritized last year reaching a deal with the insurgents, under which the US would pull its troops out of Afghanistan, which is a primary Taliban demand. In exchange, the insurgents would sever their ties with Al-Qaeda. They would stop planning attacks abroad from the Afghan soil and enter negotiations with the Afghan government on the question related to a peaceful transition leading to elections and governance. Last year, after some talks held in Geneva, President Trump invited a delegation of Taliban to come to Camp David before abruptly canceling the invitation last September, following the insurgents' insistence that that agreement that I just mentioned to you be signed before they agreed to come to Camp David. However, after a prisoner swap back in November, talks started again, with the US realizing, maybe after 19 years of being involved in the Afghan political life and nation building and military support, that pursuing negotiations was probably the best solution of the three that the US had. One was to maintain the status quo, which only offered the prospect of endless war with mounting casualties, for which, by the way, the US was largely blamed by the local population. The second one was removing its forces without any agreement, declaring victory and coming home, which probably would result in a return to the civil war of the 1990s and even worse violence. And while a US Taliban agreement would only be the first step in a very long and difficult process to a settlement among Afghans themselves, because this is the most important point. If they don't want to make peace among themselves, then there is no external power that can force them into doing so. But there are no guarantees of success, obviously. It still offers the only hope of winding down the world's deadliest war. Next comes Yemen, where the human cost of the 5-year-old civil war is also painfully clear, with more than 100,000 casualties up to now, mostly civilians, once again, pushing a country which is already the Arab world's poorest country to the brink of famine. Yemen has become a critical fault line in the Middle East-wide rivalry between Iran, which is backing up the local Houthi rebels, and Saudi Arabia and its regional allies. Yet here too, 2020 could offer a rare opportunity to wind down the conflict. And again, the turning point might be, paradoxically, the attacks that I mentioned to you, the missile attacks in September on major Saudi oil production facilities, which were claimed by the Houthis, but are suspected to have been actually conducted by Iran. An attack that highlighted the risk of an all-out war in the region that none of the actors want at the present time. As a result, the Houthis and Saudi Arabia have engaged in ongoing talks which are being brokered by the United Nations, aimed at de-escalating the conflict, which also led to a significant decrease in the number of cross-border incidents. But the opportunity for peace there should be seized now, is very short. The Houthis already show signs of impatience, which what they perceive with the Saudi sluggishness in transitioning from de-escalation to a national ceasefire. Furthermore, any risk of increase of tension between the United States and Iran in the area might also spill into Yemen. So we'll see and we'll follow closely what happens there in the next few months. Moving on to the US-North Korea relations. 2020 could be a decisive year as well. You remember that the two summits between President Trump and Chairman Kim, the first one in September 2018 in Singapore, the second one in February of last year in Hanoi, Vietnam, resulted practically in U.S. halting most joint military exercises with South Korea, and Pyongyang pausing its long-range missile and nuclear tests, not to mention the exchange of these love letters between the two leaders for a while. So last June, over a handshake in Panmunjom, which is a demilitarized zone separating the two Koreas, President Trump and Chairman Kim agreed to start working-level talks. And yet, since then, for the past 6 months, North Korea has stepped up its long-range ballistic tests, missile tests, and launched what appears to be the engine for a long-range missile in an effort to pressure Washington to lift at least partially some of the economic sanctions imposed on the country. For its part, the U.S. resumed its joint military exercises with South Korea, thus dimming prospects for diplomacy. Needless to say that such dynamic is worrisome for both leaders, for the region and for the world. If the North escalates its provocations, the Trump administration could react much like it did in 2017, with name-calling and efforts to further tighten sanctions, and openly exploring military solutions or options with unthinkable consequences. The best option for both sides remains a deal made of confidence building and of measures imposed progressively as we go along, while staying away from ill-prepared summits and this public relations stunts, which obviously haven't resulted into much up to now. Well, we'll see also what's going to happen there this year. Now, in Libya now, a ceasefire was brokered in January in Istanbul by Russia and Turkey and signed by different warring Libyan factions to end a surge in fighting there also, which had caused thousands of deaths and displaced some 300,000 civilians in this virtually failed state. It also confirmed the dominant role played by Presidents Putin and Erdogan in defining the political future of Libya. This agreement is all the more surprising because Moscow and Ankara, Russia and Turkey, are backing rival Libyan factions in this latent regional civil war. Just as a reminder, Libya has been divided since 2016 between an internationally recognized government in Tripoli and another rival government based in the eastern part of the country around Benghazi. In addition to these two governments, there are a number of militias who are fighting over Libya's oil infrastructure. In the northern part of the country, on the coastal part of the country, and tribal clashes continue in the country's vast southern desert. All this fighting was limited, however, in scope and geographically up to 2018. But then, 2 years ago, or almost 2 years ago, they took a dangerous turn. Last spring, forces commanded by a former general of Muammar Gaddafi by the name of Khalifa Haftar surrounded Tripoli, the capital, in an effort to overthrow the internationally recognized government that Haftar claimed to be corrupt, inefficient, weak, and most important, that included terrorists and Islamists. Haftar campaign, military campaign, was backed by the United Arab Emirates and by a contingent of Russian mercenaries. And it also received military support from countries like Egypt, France, and Jordan. Despite an embargo, arms embargo, by the UN in Libya. After initially supporting the Tripoli government, the US administration reversed course and now tacitly supports the Libyan military leader, the commander Haftar. Turkey, on the other hand, backs the Tripoli government for a very good reason. Just before announcing the deployment of its troops to bolster Tripoli, the Turkish government signed a deal with the Tripoli government over oil and gas drilling rights in the eastern Mediterranean. The internationalization of the conflict and the proliferation of all these foreign actors, each with its own interests, have only complicated efforts to end the fighting. And in the meantime, there are also already signs that this ceasefire or truce, which was signed in Istanbul earlier this month, may not last long, with each side accusing the other of breaking the ceasefire and reports of continuing fighting around Tripoli. Now, the result could be a more destructive stalemate or a takeover of Tripoli by the forces of Haftar that could only prolong militia fighting rather than stabilizing Libya politically. So we'll have to follow also closely this year what happens in Libya, not to mention the fact that the European Union is paying also very close attention to what's happening in Libya. since a destabilized Libya means that more migrants coming from Africa can go through Libya and cross the Mediterranean to mostly to Italy and Greece. So the European Union is following this issue also very closely. Closer to home now, Venezuela. Well, Venezuela's year of two governments, also like Libya, ended without resolution. Not only President Maduro is still in charge, having survived last April's civil uprising, yes, you remember, a regional boycott, and a number of US sanctions, but also apparently consolidating its power. A couple of weeks ago, 10 days ago, by denying access to the building of the National Assembly, which is a Venezuelan parliament in Caracas, to Juan Guaido, who is the leader of the Venezuelan opposition and the leader of the opposition party and of the parliament, preventing him from being re-elected and electing instead another political figure who is more sympathetic to Maduro government's position. Members of Guaido's opposition protested, obviously, calling the move a parliamentary coup d'etat. Nevertheless, this incident highlighted Guaido's precarious position, with his coalition in disarray and dozens of his allies either in jail or in exile. Also, President Trump, who for a short while floated the possibility of a military intervention, has turned his attention elsewhere. Guaido's own assessment of the last year events is that he underestimated Maduro's resolve to stay in power and his grip on the armed forces. With the US currently downplaying the possibility of a military intervention, the issue is now whether Maduro's obstinacy and the opposition's lack of realism can find a path to agreement. In the meantime, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans fled to neighboring countries, particularly to Colombia, some to Brazil, and the ones who are still there suffer from dire living and economic conditions. Now, in order to reach an agreement between the two sides, the opposition would have to drop its demand that Maduro leave now. And the government would have to accept steps to ensure a credible and international monitored parliamentary election in 2020. Such a scenario, however, faces huge odds. As long as Maduro still believes that Venezuela's economic downfall could be somewhat cushioned by Russia or by Russian help, Chinese help, and to lesser extent Cuban help, and the opposition still clings to the idea that somehow the United States will find a way with its the coalition of the regional neighboring countries, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, and others, find a way to push Maduro into exile. So we'll see what will happen in Venezuela as well. And finally, the disputed region of Kashmir, which after falling off the radar for a number of years, is back now, has been brought back to the international attention by a flare-up between India and Pakistan last year. As you know, both countries claim this Himalayan territory as their own. This territory is split by an informal boundary, the so-called line of control, since the first Indian-Pakistani war back in 1947-1948. Where tensions rose in that area in last August, when India abruptly revoked the semi-autonomous status of the Jammu and Kashmir state, which is the only Muslim majority state in India, and brought it under New Delhi's direct rule. The change was made without any local consultations. And prior to the decision, in order to prevent any popular disruptions and protests, the Indian government brought in thousands of extra troops, imposed a communications blackout, and arrested a great number of Kashmiri political figures, many of whom were not hostile to India. Well, needless to say that Pakistan had immediately tried to rally international support against what it calls India's illegal decision on Kashmir status. As a matter of fact, Pakistan's Prime Minister met with President Trump last week at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, to appeal for the American mediation on that issue. However, Pakistan's cause is not helped by its long record of backing anti-Indian militants in Kashmir. Moreover, most Western powers see India as an important economic partner and are very unlikely to rock the boat over Kashmir unless violence spirals out of control. The gravest danger in Kashmir is that a militant attack, there were many on different cities across India, set off an escalation in this sensitive region. A strike on Indian forces almost certainly would precipitate Indian retaliation against Pakistan, regardless of whether Pakistan is complicit in this plan. In a worst-case scenario, the two nuclear-armed neighbors could stumble into war. And yet, resuming bilateral negotiations, which are on hold now since 2016, will not be easy, as any progress would require Pakistan taking credible action against militants operating on its soil, against India, which is a non-negotiable precondition for India for even considering sitting down at the table with Pakistan. And for the Indian government to release and re-engage Kashmiri political leaders. And it might take the full weight of foreign powers and major powers to get there. So these are, in a nutshell, the spotlights on areas of tension that will need to be monitored this year. And I wonder if the number of get-togethers will be enough to cover all of them. You might have noticed that I left out of this laundry list the Middle East, which in my opinion is traditionally and constantly a hotspot. So it doesn't even have to be mentioned, and which deserves our full attention at all times, as well as obviously the U.S. relations with China and Russia in the future, for which I do not foresee any degradation this year, since again this is an election year in the United States. So I do not believe that China or Russia will try to rock the boat, not knowing exactly what type of administration they will be facing starting next January. But you never know. So that being said, let's have a short break and come back with your questions. Thank you very much. Again, since this is, again, our first meeting this year, if you have any questions of any concerns of any nature, it's fine for today. It doesn't have to be on the actually the subject covers a lot of areas, so any question will do. All right, we start with you. Just a second.
In the current political climate in the United States, could you kind of summarize the Democratic candidates and any, if they have any positions on some of the issues that you're speaking of, these six areas? It's not something that I think is gaining too much popularity with the current press and media with what's going on, but briefly, do you have any thoughts as to the different candidates and what their positions might be?
I do have my opinion, but I don't know if I want to share it with you. Because as I probably you haven't come to every meeting that we have, and I mentioned it many times, that there are areas which I stay away from as much as I can, so that now that we have a standing room only here, I try to avoid as much as possible boxing matches in this room over domestic issues. That being said, more seriously, I was definitely going this year at some point, and probably after the Democratic nomination, convention, both conventions, Republican and Democrat, go over the main points of the foreign policies by the two opponents who will be left. You'll understand that I'll try to avoid as much as I can getting into details, particularly for one party in this very divisive, politically speaking, period that we're living in. What I can tell you is that, as usual, foreign policy is not a priority, and it never been, and it never will be a priority of an election, a presidential debate, for the very simple reason that economy is basically the most important component, and it's only normal that the kitchen table issues have priority over what happens somewhere else in the world, particularly in this country, which I mentioned many times for very good and understandable reason. This country is huge, it's self-sufficient, it's a whole continent, and unlike Europe, which is composed of, there is a European Union in name right now, but it's basically only in name when it comes to foreign policy, where every nation is very sensitive to what happens to its neighbors across the border because of history and many wars that they went through. The United States in itself is a little away from that, geographically speaking and economically speaking. It is self-sufficient. So it's only normal that the public opinion will pay less attention to what's going on abroad than what is happening in this country. This being said, foreign policy is important in this country, particularly when it affects the American interest, or when America is in war with another country, or then the public becomes aware of what's going on in other parts of the world. But otherwise, on a daily basis, if I may say, foreign policy doesn't play such an important role in the U.S., and probably unless many things happen in between now and the elections in November, in terms of foreign policy, some issues will come up, obviously. Iran, the Middle East, North Korea, where the U.S. has been engaged for a number of years diplomatically. But otherwise, foreign policy in itself is not such a big issue in the United States. So I don't want to get into the details of different candidates from one party, because they are just vying for position right now. And maybe some of those positions will be changed if one of them becomes is nominated for, because you know how it is when it's very easy to take more extremist positions, generally speaking, when you don't have the responsibility of carrying out those positions. One you're in office, you see things differently. But that's true for domestic policies also. Very often promises are made, and generally speaking, once you're in office, 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, you come out with a statement that basically says, I didn't expect the previous administration to leave me such a mess, So all the promises that I have made, and this is true for, again, I don't want to get into Republican, Democrat, or other, and that is true in the United States, as it is true in any country, in any democracy, I would say. They left me such a mess that the promises I made you, definitely I'll keep them, but down the road, for the time being, for the next 3 years, I cannot do much, or 4 years. And then I see you at the next elections. So I really don't want to get into foreign policy of one party, particularly at this time. That being said, again, we'll have time to discuss it over the course of this year, and as we get closer to, particularly, I've done that, I guess, in 2016, although I don't know if we had classes already in 2016, but I've done that in 2017 for sure, at the beginning of Trump's presidency. I reviewed the foreign policy that Trump promised, from the transactional nature of Trump's foreign policy, and what the Democrats would have done had they been in office at the time. So this time, since we have the whole year ahead of us, we'll definitely have one meeting which will be dedicated to the foreign policy of the two parties, okay, when we have a candidate from the Democratic side. I'm sorry that was a long answer. You had to wait, but you're holding the microphone, so that's...
Okay. Having been here for several
yes.
sessions,
you knew better not to ask, right?
I understand your positions on dealing with domestic policy. But you gave us an impressive list of things to keep us awake for the next year this morning. So,
well, you would be keeping awake anyway. Anyway.
So what I'm wondering is what's your level of confidence that our U.S. State Department at this point is up to being able to deal with all of that stuff that's coming? I mean, we've been reading a lot about how...
So it's still a domestic type of...
no, it's not. It's
State Department. I know, it's State Department.
Yeah.
That the State Department would be able to carry out what?
Would be able to deal with these...
All these issues?
With these issues as they come
These
along.
issues existed before even this State Department existed or not. So the State Department is able to the State Department, or I would call that the Foreign Ministry of the United States. I have full confidence that the Foreign Ministry of the United States, whatever the administration, is fully capable of dealing with 6 or 7 or 10 or 20 issues at the same time, since they have different departments and different people. It's a very large administration. So I'm fully confident that they can deal with it. How well, that's another story, but that, fortunately for me, it wasn't your question. But, or that's the way I want to interpret it. But they can deal with any crisis that comes up, old or present or in the future. How? That can, that we can discuss, subject to interpretation.
I was wondering what you think the impact now is of taking down the Iranian general, both in Iran and outside of Iran.
Well, it doesn't seem to have a lot of impact now that all this emotion has died down. Let me say one thing in particular. Soleimani was not a very popular guy in Iran itself.
Really?
It might come as a surprise to you, but he was not particularly a hero, except for the leadership in Iran, because he was responsible for setting a whole strategy of the Iranian military and special forces in Iran against enemies inside Iran and outside. So, as such, he was definitely extremely active in setting up the type of military, I should say, intelligence, like actions that Iran very often undertook abroad against opposition leaders, against political leaders from immediately after Ayatollah Khomeini came back from exile in France in 1979. There was a time in the 80s where a number of Iranian political leaders who fled Iran, and most of them came to France, including a former prime minister, were assassinated in Paris by some of these Iranian agents, and Soleimani was the major actor in all this incidents. So he was the brain by itself for putting together this policy. That being said, he was very, very unpopular in Iran because the repression was also conducted in Iran itself, domestically speaking, against the opposition members in Iran, being in Iran. So he was not particularly well liked in Iran, except that he was extremely efficient. And for the past few years, he's been particularly active since Iran started asserting its power and increasing its influence in the region, particularly with its proxies in Lebanon, with Hezbollah, and also recently, for the past couple of years, in Syria, setting up small units of military outposts, if you will, of Iranian presence on Syrian soil, strengthening the position of Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, all that in an open effort to eventually use those people someday against Israel. So, once again, except for the emotion of the moment when you saw a number of people in Tehran and maybe a few cities around Iran, maybe you have to think that Iran has 80 million people and a few thousand were demonstrating. So it shows that his popularity didn't extend to the whole country, and it was mostly. It was definitely a military blow to Iran, more than anything else, and also it could be a deterrent. It could be a deterrent for Iran. As a matter of fact, the Iranians' retaliation was relatively muted. So was actually, which was even more surprising, the lack of reaction, almost total reaction, of the other Arab countries. You have no, obviously Saudi Arabia wouldn't mourn Soleimani because of the Shia-Sunni dispute. But no other Arab countries, to my knowledge, has made such a big deal out of it. And not only that, but the Arab League, which is usually very quick to meet and condemn, generally speaking, Israel and the United States for any such incident in the Middle East never met. They never convened a special session, and the Arab countries had no reaction whatsoever, including, which is surprising, including in Iraq, which has a Shiite majority, including Bahrain, which is a Shiite majority, and Lebanon, where Hezbollah is running the country, basically, or at least the political arm of the Hezbollah is running the country. So it was if there is such a thing, the target was well chosen, if I would say, if there is such a thing, by the U.S. And there were no reaction. So in a way, the U.S. could get away with it. Yes. You have your microphone.
I do. Oh, okay. I didn't see it. Okay, just as a follow-up.
What a luxury.
I was going to shout. Just as a follow-up to that about Iraq. Okay, there was an Iraqi general that was also killed along. Isn't that the case?
It was an Iraqi or Iranian general who was also killed.
I think it was Iraqi.
Iraqi,
Yeah.
okay.
And then the Iraqis started making noises about throwing the U.S. out of Iraq. And I don't know what's come
All
of
right,
that.
but this is not the first time that the Iraqis are publicly demanding that the U.S. troop leave Iraq. Publicly. Privately, I'm not so sure. I believe that privately they want the U.S. to stay there because even though there is a Shiite majority in the country, the Shiite majority is in the south, and there were a number of demonstrations lately in Iraq against what people perceive too close a tie between Baghdad and Tehran. So the Sunni minority, which is a very large minority in Iraq, is not very happy with the course of, or with the turn that the Iraqi policy is taking. And they made it known to the Iraqi leadership. So the Iraqi leadership has some issues and some problems with the Iraqi population. So they have to be very careful how close they get to Iran. So asking publicly for the U.S. to remove its forces from Iraq is one thing. Asking them really, by the way, what the parliament voted on in Iraq is a non-binding resolution, which means in good, normal layman terms, wishful thinking. Because the government itself didn't come out and ask officially the United States to leave Iraq. They know very well that they cannot afford it anyway at this time. There are too many issues internally with the Kurds, with the Shiites and the Sunnis in Iraq, with the fact that the government is totally unstable and doesn't rule the country, except for the green zone, and even that in Baghdad, the government doesn't have much influence over what's going on in the country. It's the militias which keep control militarily of what's going on in Iraq. Al-Badr militias, the Shiite militias in the south around Basra, and the Shiite militias in the rest of the country, with the Kurdish region also. So Iraq, basically, for all intents and purposes, if it were not for the American presence there, would probably be divided in three regions. As it is divided, but not de facto is divided already in three regions. The Kurdish region, the Sunni region, and the Shiite region. For the time being, there is a central government. But how strong this central government is and how efficiently it can run Iraq without an outside present and support, nobody will ask for. Even the Shiites do not ask for it, for the Americans to leave the country. Yes, once in a while to let off some steam, but basically speaking, they are very happy to have an American presence there, to keep some kind of control of what's going on in Iraq. Yes?
It's a slightly different topic, but with a potential pandemic with China and the Wuhan coronavirus, I'm just wondering, internationally, I know there's the World Health Organization. I'm not sure who participates in that, and I'm just wondering if there's any sort of organization other than that World Health Organization that will rise up to have a global and interconnected response to a potential pandemic.
Well, the WHO, the World Health Organization, is an agency of the United Nations. So all the countries which are members of the United Nations are part of the HEO, whose headquarters are in Rome, in Italy. To my knowledge, they met last week on this particular issue, but they declined for the time being to declare a global epidemic. So it is something that has been spreading, obviously, but for the time being, the opinion of most of experts, and I'm definitely not an expert in that area, that most of experts believe that it can be contained nationally. Well, China was trying to contain it nationwide, but considering how huge China is, and now every city is trying to fend for itself, which makes the central government job much more difficult. So every city where there were cases of this type of flu, of this type of virus, have taken local measures, which is basically blocking off the whole, isolating the whole area. So for the time being, I understand there were almost 60 million Chinese who cannot travel and who are basically stuck in the cities where they live in order to try and contain this virus. A number of cases were detected in other parts of the world, but for the time being, apparently, it doesn't need to be bring to the status of global epidemics. It remains to be seen how things will be developing, whether it can be contained locally or if it's going to spread. To answer your second question is that, yes, besides the WHO, there is no global organization which takes care of health issues in the world. However, you have a lot of NGOs which are extremely active in the area of healthcare around the world. And they are interconnected and they work together. In China, in Japan, in Europe, in the United States, And it's through them that a global effort can also be conducted in that respect. But WHO, generally speaking, unlike the United Nations Secretariat, this agency can be very efficient. And it showed it was very efficient with the Ebola crisis in Africa in particular. So there is hope that this virus can be contained, and that in the meantime some kind of cure can be found in the foreseeable future. Yes, Alan.
Yeah. I wanted to get back to one of the areas you were discussing, that's Libya. And I'm puzzled by the fact that you have...
Can you speak in the microphone?
Right. Okay. Is this better? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So that people who are home watching us on television because they don't deserve it, but...
I'm on television. I'm puzzled by the fact that you have this division between an internationally supported government in Tripoli and a rebel government, I guess it would be described, in Benghazi. Who is it that's designated as the internationally supported government? Is it the UN?
It's the UN, yes.
Yeah. So that was pursuant to some sort of decision that the Security Council, including Russia, had to participate in. Am I right?
They participated in it, yes.
And so now they're on the other side?
No, the Russians are on the other side right now, yes. That happens, Alan, you'd be surprised.
They changed their minds?
Politics make very strange bad fellows. They are on the other side, and I believe that this is my belief, that Russia again is looking out for its own interest in Libya, which is what? Gas and oil. The Turks were much more open about it. They, I don't want to use the word quiproquo nowadays because this is not implication, but that's exactly what the Turks have done in Libya. They said to the government in Tripoli, I don't know if I love you more than I love General Haftar, the rebel general. However, you're controlling some of these facilities and some of the oil and gas which was recently found in the Eastern Mediterranean. We'd like to have some drilling rights to those areas. We're going to help you anyway. However, the help would be more forthcoming if we can have an agreement on this before we send out our troops. So, Tripoli government militarily being somewhat weaker than Haftar, Haftar's people, agreed to it. So the Turks are helping out on the other side. The Russians are doing somewhat the same thing, but differently. Like in Ukraine, for instance, they are not involved directly, so that Russia cannot be blamed or accused of sending direct military troops. Not to mention, as I said earlier, that Libya has been under an arms embargo by the UN since the fall of Gaddafi back in 2011. But this arms embargo is being violated left and right by all the powers involved, including by France, which is sending arms to Haftar. The French position is that it's also oil and gas, or obviously, even if it's not mentioned, but it's more political. The French position is that there are Islamists and jihadists in the government in Tripoli, and Haftar promised to fight terrorism in Libya. And this is also the reason why the US administration after supporting or backing the Tripoli government, reverse course, and now they are saying, well, Haftar, after all, we might not particularly care for him, but he promised to fight terrorism in Libya, and fighting terrorism being our number one priority in the United States, we're going to give support and help any military faction that could be Kurds in Syria or Haftar in Libya, which is fighting openly terrorism and Islamists. So this is where we are standing. This is where we are standing now. It's a stalemate because with the troops, Turkish troops sent to the area, Haftar forces which were advancing on Tripoli are stuck now. So they cannot go forward, and they are reluctant to provoke the Turkish troops. And the Europeans now, they are looking at the situation. They haven't done anything as usual, the European Union. They've been sitting back and waiting for things to develop. But now, with the Turkish presence in that area, and with the Turks having already threatened the European Union to send some 3 million Syrian refugees on their soil to the European Union, if they cannot agree of some kind of talks between, because Turkey still has not given up on its ambition to join the European Union at some point. But the European Union said no for the time being. We do not want new members. The only members we might consider are the small countries in the Balkans, the ex-Yugoslav republics of Montenegro and Macedonia, North Macedonia, as it is called today. But we don't want negotiation with Turkey is another animal. So Turkey will have to improve on its human rights and has to give up his missile system which it acquired from Russia and show us that it's a reliable ally before we open any discussions with Turkey on joining the European Union. To which Erdogan responded, well, if that's the case, don't forget that I have here, we agreed on Turkey holding like all these Syrian refugees on its soil, for which Turkey received $6 billion, by the way. But we might as well open our borders and send them all to Greece, to the European Union, and you work it out. So the European Union is very reluctant to really provoke Turkey too much, but at the same time, with an influx again of African refugees again to Europe because of all this ongoing war and dire economic conditions in Africa. They follow very closely what's going on in Libya, because the Europeans, in addition, would not like to see Turkey start drilling oil and gas in the Mediterranean. It is bad enough for the Europeans that Turkey occupies half of Cyprus, which is part of the European Union. I mean, the Greek part is part of the European Union. They don't want to see the Turks, in addition, in the Eastern Mediterranean, start drilling and having a military presence in Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a very complicated situation, and once again, every country so far in Europe has acted, despite of the European Union common foreign policy, every country acted by itself. As a matter of fact, on Libya, France and Italy which is a former colonial power in Libya, have totally different position because of the gas and oil drills also. The Italian accusing the French of helping this guy who was a former general of Gaddafi, whom the French, by the way, overthrew. So it goes to show that in foreign policy, it's a very changing situation. One day you're my friend, and the next you're my enemy, and I overthrow you. However, I'm following your positions on some issues because it's more convenient for us to do so. So don't be surprised if I'm so cynical when it comes to this issue. More questions? Anything? Yes. I haven't heard from you. Yeah, I haven't heard from you. Yeah, just a second.
Regarding North Korea and a nuclear device, it seems the United States just does saber rattling. And with Iran, there's this veiled threat that they would use violence to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons. Do you think the United States would use military action to stop Iran, or Israel or some other allies to collaterally go in there, or are they just saber rattling like they are in North Korea?
It's somewhat a different situation, because even though the United States does not acknowledge it publicly, the United States knows very well that North Korea has already the nuclear weapon. Now the question is just acquiring the capacity of launching it, or of delivering it to another country. That's why there is not so much talk about the nuclear weapons per se as it is about the launching and the tests of missiles, long-range missiles. Short-range, it cannot be helped. That is a fait accompli. They can bomb Japan, probably, not to mention South Korea. So this is a fait accompli. The only thing now is whether or not they're going to be able to develop the capacity of launching their nuclear weapons far enough to reach the United States. And that remains a question mark. Nobody really knows exactly if they acquired the capability or not. Now, for Iran, the difference is that it seems, and I say it seems, I don't know, that Iran does not have yet, unlike North Korea, the goods. So the US is trying to prevent Iran from getting a bomb. Unlike North Korea, Iran is perceived as a threat for the stability of the whole of the Middle East, not only because of the nuclear weapon, but because of its proxies in the area. Hezbollah, they even work now with Hamas in Gaza. They have all type of militias and strong militias in Iraq, as you know. So in Syria, for the past 2 years, they expanded their presence in Syria. So Iran represents a real threat in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen with the Houthis. And unlike North Korea doesn't have proxies. Okay, North Korea is an isolated country. It is by itself. It's acquired a nuclear weapon, which might or might not be able to deliver. But basically, it's isolated. It's isolated from the rest of the world. Not so for Iran. So if the U.S. is showing a position which is probably more aggressive towards Iran than North Korea, it's because of that. It's because Iran has a lot of conventional weapons, because Iran is expanding its presence and its influence in the Middle East through its proxies, because Iran does not have the means nor the capacity of being directly in those countries. So the only way for Iran to exercise some influence is through proxies. And through proxies, they are very strong. They are very well implanted in the Middle East. So for the United States, it's essential to be able to counteract this presence, Iranian presence in the area. So thus their probably more aggressive position on Iran than on North Korea.
Well, Mike Pompeo said, don't worry about it. They're not going to get it. And it was really like a veiled threat. I mean, I'm asking, is that saber rattling, or do you think
I
the
have to ask
administration...
Pompeo. I have to ask Pompeo what he meant when he made his this statement. I have to call him after our meeting. That being said, I don't know. Publicly, the only thing I can say publicly, you can say, make all type of threats. Particularly, this administration has, for the past 3 years, very undiplomatically, if I may say, has been using this undiplomatic language of threatening, of name-calling, which is not common. But we tend to forget because it's been 3 years of this. But it's not common for a Secretary of State to say, don't worry about it, they will not get the nuclear weapon. It's not something that Henry Kissinger would have said in his time, all right? Because diplomacy was conducted differently than through social media, but the times have changed. Not necessarily for the better, but they have changed. So he makes this statement. Is it for domestic consumption? Most likely. As far as North Korea goes, it was never acknowledged officially by the U.S. that North Korea has nuclear weapons. And everybody knows that they have nuclear weapons. It's not a question of not letting them acquire nuclear weapons that they have already, apparently between 20 and 60 small nuclear bombs already in their arsenal. The question now is, are they going to continue with this program? Are they going to develop it, make it more efficient and stronger? That's a question. For Iran, that's a different story, because Iran is a threat for the other countries in the region, and might also, if they acquire the nuclear weapon, prompt other countries in the area of developing their own nuclear weapons. And in a neighborhood as sensitive as the Middle East is, that's all we need, to have 3 or 4 countries which have the nuclear weapons and might be very tempted to use it. Up to now, a nuclear weapons was understood anyway, to be used as a deterrent. It was not supposed to be used as a weapon, or except for Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But that being said, that was the exception to the rule. But it was a deterrent. Not to use hard power, to use only soft power, because you know that in order to be able to influence with soft power, you have to have a very strong military behind you to dissuade the other side, or to make the other side, to make them sure that they understand that there is a real threat. It's not something that you just say off the top of your head. So it never came to anybody's mind that a nuclear weapon could be used as an aggressive weapon one day. Well, not so much anymore. So that's why in the case of Iran, it's somewhat a different proposition from North Korea. All right, that being said, I hope you depressed enough for the week. That should do it. And let's have a little more fun next week with Brexit, if we can. Everything is right. Thank you.